In recent years, various aspects of Australian history and culture have faced critical scrutiny from activists and members of the press who align themselves with Aboriginal advocacy. Australia has been painted with a broad brush of genocide of its so-called native people, and widespread oppression has followed to silence the very rich history of what they are calling pre-colonial civilization.
And if you challenge any of this and point out its flaws, you are a morally bad person who insults Aboriginal people and wounds their self-esteem.
It seems to me that purposely placed disinformation has made its way into the realm of history, academia, science, education, and even entertainment. These actions are aimed at challenging and delegitimizing Australia as a nation. Today, I want to explore how much of this has been exaggerated and fabricated by the Aboriginal industrial complex, whether or not it is politically loaded, and how much of it is even true. As Australia approaches the upcoming referendum on the voice to Parliament and discussions about a possible Makarrata Treaty, it becomes increasingly important to engage in critical analysis and the seeking of truth regarding these topics. The first point I want to focus on is the claim that Aboriginals are native to the land of Australia, with a history in the land spanning back more than 60,000 years of continued existence. We are told that there is a widespread scientific consensus on this issue and that there exists genetic DNA evidence, as well as anthropological and archaeological evidence. The Australian people also generally accept it on face value, without really understanding what the evidence actually is. One thing that needs to be noted about the claim of there being some sort of scientific consensus is that this is not how science works. This is how politics work. Science is not based on a vote, nor is it based on popularity or democracy. Science is based on facts, empirical data, and the exploration of hard evidence. The claim of Aboriginal nativity and the 60,000-year-long continued existence is based more so in politics than it is in conclusive scientific evidence. There are many historical biases, methodological concerns, and even alternative interpretations which have been presented by critics with scientific backing, but these are usually swept under the rug and ignored. These claims of 60,000 years and nativity seem to be published all over the internet and repeated exhaustively by authors and journalists. So what is the actual scientific evidence behind the claim of Aboriginals being native to the land and having a continued existence for more than 60,000 years? Upon closer examination, the foundation of this narrative appears to rest in three key focal points. There is a reference to a genetic study commissioned by the Australian Research Council on behalf of the University of Adelaide in 2014. Yet accessing this study presents considerable challenges, with links frequently missing, broken, or obscured behind a paywall requiring a $30 fee. Fortunately, I was able to acquire a PDF copy of this study through alternative means. When you read back the abstract and conclusions of this study, the entire premise is based on DNA in hair samples collected from 111 people, 44 being Aboriginal people, across Australia in the early to mid-1900s. How much of the Aboriginal DNA was pure, admixture, or the result of miscegenation is not even mentioned or considered in this study. In the first few pages of this study breakdown, they openly admit that their findings are based on theoretical calculations, on theoretical timelines, in a theoretical molecular clock. Quote, "The timing of human arrival in Australia was estimated using the age of the most recent common ancestor, TMRCA. For the different Australian-only haplogroups, calculated using a molecular clock with substitution rates calibrated with ancient European and Asian mitogenomes. Although these TMRCA values are likely to be minimal estimates, given the limited sampling, they group in a narrow window of time." Unquote. The scientists concluded that the mitochondrial DNA tracing showed that the Aboriginal people of Australia have genetic ties and are related to other Melanesian people of the Indian Ocean, with their closest relative being the people of Papua New Guinea. They also claim that Aboriginals must have been here for 50,000 years, because that's how long ago they estimate the land masses between Australia and Papua have been separated by ocean water, isolating the Aboriginals from other land masses of the Indian Ocean. This comprehensive study was initiated with funding from individuals who possessed a pre-existing historical bias and a clear political agenda. Despite being bestowed with numerous awards, the study's findings remain speculative at best, as acknowledged by the scientists themselves, who based their conclusions on theory and calculations rather than concrete, irrefutable evidence. There were many critics who claimed that the sample sizes were too small or that the data interpretation was flawed, leading to inaccurate conclusions. There were others who showed that the presence of ancient DNA in the region could be equally attributed to interactions with neighbouring populations rather than a continuous occupation by the same ancestral group. In fact, it seems more likely interactions with other lands took place since there are so many accounts of people arriving prior to the English. In some instances, there have been controversies or debates within the scientific community about specific archaeological findings. The voices of these critics have regrettably been overlooked. The second point of focus used as evidence is the anthropological research, which we have already touched on. The fact that Papua and Australia is separated by water, and the notion that Aboriginals don't use boats. Alternative theories have been formulated by scientists who have done their own studies on the matter, but these were never popularised in Australia. Like the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany, which found Indian and Mananwan populations made contact with the Australian continent only a few thousand years ago, which have genetic links to the Aboriginal people of today. Other points worthy of consideration comes to the diary logs of Captain James Cook himself, who employed the help of a man from Tahiti, who showed that people of the Indian Ocean had already visited Australia and were already familiar with sea travel and the use of star navigation. This indicates that it's very possible tribes from the Indian Ocean didn't necessarily walk across Papua to Australia 50,000 years ago or 60,000 years ago. They very well could have travelled here by boat or raft only a few thousand years ago. Professor Satish Kumar is currently serving as the Professor and Dean of School of Forensic Science at the National Forensic Science University in India. Upon many years of genetic testing and research, he concluded that there was in fact a genetic link between Aboriginals and Indian people. He claims the mitochondrial DNA shared between the M42 haplogroups were found exclusively in pre-Dravidian Indians and Australian Aboriginals, and nowhere else in the world. He believes that prior to the Aboriginals of Australia arriving a few thousand years ago, that there were pygmy people. With reference in the Atlas of Foreign Countries, written between 265 and 316 AD, Chinese sea captains describe the mysterious Great South Land being inhabited by a race of 1 metre tall pygmies. Frank and Alexander Jardine settled Cape York, recorded that they've witnessed metre tall pygmies being hunted down like kangaroos by taller Aboriginals. In the 1400s and the 1500s, Dutch and Portuguese sailors, sighting the Western Australian coastlines, noted tall natives in warfare chasing and killing hordes of little native peoples. There seem to be more than a few historical primary citations which mention a race of pygmies pre-existing Aboriginals, and even being hunted down to extinction by the Aboriginals. It's very possible that the Aboriginals in Australia today are not native to the land and may have actually killed off the actual native indigenous pygmies of Australia. Not only is there historical citations for this, but there may even be archaeological evidence. There has been the discovery of ancient endocar skulls, which have a different physiognomy and phenotypical skull shape to the Aboriginals. The third point of focus is perhaps the most redundant, but it seems to be the point that is taken most seriously by academics and politicians. This is the tradition of Aboriginal oral law. Aboriginals did not have any dating methods, and they do not do any record keeping at all. Therefore, it is absurd to accept any timing or dates that they give as factual. All accounts of the Indigenous history rely on oral traditions and stories passed down through generations. The reliability of this type of evidence gets distorted and exaggerated with time and cannot be taken seriously. In the second part of this video, I want to focus on the fabrication of Aboriginal history, the invention of their culture, and the myth of there being an Aboriginal nation or a civilization prior to Australia being settled by the British in 1788. I feel like this is a very important area of focus, as much of the land rights issue, as well as the idea of a voice to Parliament, stems from the idea that there was in fact a nation already existing in Australia, which was apparently conquered and genocided by British invaders. There has already been a great deal of work and research done into these topics by people like Keith Wintershuttle and the Honourable Arthur A. Calwell, who have written books on Australia's history and the fraud of Aboriginal history, as well as Andrew Bolt, reporter at Sky News, who has been reporting on the exaggerations and distortions of Aboriginal history being used as an agenda of politically motivated people for over a decade. When activists and politicians advocate for giving the Australian nation over to the Aboriginal people, it should be duly noted that Aboriginal people were never a nation. Upon the arrival of British settlers, Australia was only made up of about 500 different tribes, each with their own language and customs, who were often warring with each other over food and access to water. There was also much of the land in Australia that was uninhabited and not claimed by any particular tribe. So when they talk about land rights, treaty, and handing over the nation of Australia to Aboriginal people, one should ask, which Aboriginal people? As they were never unified as a people, and the concept of nationhood and naming cities was foreign to them. You might notice how the left-wing government of Australia is talking about renaming a lot of our cities back to their so-called traditional Aboriginal names. There is no evidence that there was any cultural consensus over large geographical areas having any traditional names. They may have had names for mountains and rivers and things like that, but how could they have a name for the exact geographical area of, say, Brisbane for an example, before Brisbane even existed, and was built up into the city that it is today? It's impossible. Are we going to be led to believe that it just so happens that Meanjin was the exact same place in area size as Brisbane before anything was ever built there? It's absurd. The fact of the matter is, Aboriginal people have never been a civilization. There is no evidence of agriculture or farming ever being used, which is the very basis of what a civilization is. There was never a functioning alphabet, and there existed no culture at all outside the very primitive hunter-gathering nomadic lifestyles that they lived, as was expressly documented by the settlers and scientists who arrived in Australia. It has never been proven that Aboriginals progressed past Stone Age technology, which was the prevailing opinion of the National Geographic up until recent years.
Senator Hanson.
Thank you very much. Labor loves that it was one of their very own who delivered the Stolen Generations apology. Kevin Rudd did the hard sell on the apology, telling Australians it was necessary for us to move forward together as a nation. However, Anthony Albanese has decided to turn us backward as two separate nations divided by race. That's the real end game. That's ultimately where the racist voice to Parliament will take us. Labor is committed to implementing the Uluru Statement in full, so the voice is only the first step. The next step is truth-telling, but Labor can't bring itself to tell the truth about its plans for the voice. Labor can't admit the truth that the elitist, out-of-touch, Aboriginal industry, which concocted the Uluru Statement, has for decades now been responsible for the failure to close the gaps. Labor won't admit the truth that out uncounted billions of dollars the Aboriginal industry has stolen from taxpayers has failed to help Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living in the violence, plague, economic and social dead ends we call remote communities. The truth is, this industry is made up of thousands of corrupt and dysfunctional Aboriginal corporations and land councils. The truth is, these organisations are only interested in lining their own pockets and using their power to punch down on the truly disadvantaged Aborigines they despise and the few good people who are really trying to help them.
The issue of Indigenous Protected Areas, IPA, runs parallel to the matter of land rights in Australia. IPA are areas considered culturally significant to Aboriginal people. with volunteers and Aboriginal-led NGOs determining their importance. In many cases, these areas are closed off to white people who do not identify as Aboriginal. Unfortunately, the decision-making process relies solely on their word, without the need of formal proof. Consequently, there have been instances where businesses were compelled to close due to a cultural significance claim. Basically, anywhere they find a fishbone in the dirt, it can be considered a place of cultural significance. Appealing such declarations or seeking independent expert assessments is currently unavailable, leaving affected parties with limited recourse. Presently, over 87 million hectares, constituting 50% of Australia's National Reserve System, is designated as an IPA, and further land acquisitions continue. With the potential empowerment of the voice to Parliament in the Makarrata Treaty, concerns arise regarding the implications of what some view as a form of racial land privatisation. Recent government action includes an allocation of $231.5 million in additional funding for the IPA program from July 2023 to June 2028. In July of this year, it was reported that tree planting work along the Canning River was halted after an Aboriginal corporation demanded $2.5 million. According to XYZ, who reported on this topic, quote, amid ongoing confusions over the implementation of Western Australia's controversial new cultural heritage laws, 2 major tree planting events in the state were cancelled this week after an Aboriginal corporation demanded $2.5 million for approval. So you have this group who has volunteered their time and money into planting 5,500 shrubs and trees along the Canning River to help with conservation efforts in this Aboriginal designated area. Unfortunately, the Aboriginals don't care about that they're going to be given all of this stuff for free. They want $2.5 million for approval. Even much of what is contributed toward Aboriginal culture is not in fact Aboriginal. The most famous example of this would be Aboriginal dot painting, which originated 40 years ago back in 1971. Geoffrey Barden, a white French artist, was assigned as an art teacher for the children of the Aboriginal people in Papunya, near Alice Springs. He noticed Aboriginal children would draw symbols into the dirt when he was telling stories. He utilised this and created his own art form, which was then popularised by Aboriginal children. In time, this sort of art was considered culturally significant to Aboriginal people and attributed to their long spiritual history in Australia. Many Aboriginals would even later sue non-Aboriginal artists for using this type of art method, claiming it was culturally insensitive to steal and appropriate their ancient craft for the purpose of seeking profit. The most famous example of inventing Aboriginal history and culture is none other than author Bruce Pascoe. Bruce Pascoe is an Australian writer and author who claims to be Aboriginal. He has written over 30 books on Aboriginal pseudo-history. It is essential to approach any historical work, including Dark Emu, with critical thinking and an open mind. When examining historical citations or their interpretations, it's crucial to consider multiple sources of evidence, scholarly research, and peer-reviewed publications. Bruce didn't do any of that. He went into the topic with a political agenda and a historical bias, purposely misrepresenting evidence, sometimes even relying on fictitious work and often resorting to gross exaggerations.
They defended him against accusations of falsely claiming Indigenous heritage, even when Michael Mansell, the chairman of the Aboriginal Land Council of Tasmania, wrote last year, quote, for political reasons, journalists of the left wanted to believe Pascoe was genuine and put up the blinkers to any contrary view. Now they must eat humble pie and admit they got it all wrong.
The warning signs were there all along, but the ABC refused to acknowledge them, even when the warnings came from figures you'd think they would pay attention to. Former ABC journalist Kerry O'Brien last year
has asserted in a critique in the Monthly magazine that you regularly exaggerate and embellish the facts in Dark Emu. Such selective quoting creates an impression of societies with a sturdiness, permanence, sedentarism and technical sophistication that's not supported by the source material.
One of the claims he made is that Aboriginal people were the world's first bakers, who harvested grain and seed and baked them into bread, 15,000 years before the Egyptians did. His evidence for this? He cites what he believes are grindstones and the pushed-over bales of grass mounds. You would think that Aboriginal people who had a diet of very little carbohydrates would have continued this practice, and that there would be an abundance of evidence to support it. Or maybe Bruce is misrepresenting the facts in order to spin a story and sell a book. Bruce Pascoe was even promoted heavily by the ABC and other media outlets for his work on Aboriginal history, culture, and agriculture, until he was exposed as a fraud who made the whole thing up.
Dark emu. Now, this is a beautifully grounded history, a real game changer.
And pre-colonial Indigenous societies actually farmed the land and had a system of democracy which ensured peace across the continent.
Was a thriving Indigenous culture with technology, settlements and agriculture.
Indigenous communities were so tied to the land, they built houses, they grew crops, they irrigated them. It's not the story that we're used to.
There are not many books that change the way people think, that actually shift ideas. Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu is one of those books.
Critics, like Andrew Bolt, argue that Pascoe misinterpreted or exaggerated certain pieces of evidence to support his claims about Aboriginal agricultural practices. A significant PR campaign is promoting the notion that Australia's history is characterised by state-sponsored oppression and genocide of Aboriginal people. This idea seems prevalent across social media, mainstream media, and various written works, which create a common narrative. It is suggested that the Australian government sanctioned ethnic cleansing, leading to the brutal murder of hundreds of thousands of innocent Aboriginal men, women, and children. And some even claim the death toll to be in the millions, even though there was never millions of Aboriginals living here. It is crucial to recognise that these assertions are not supported by historical evidence. Respected historian Henry Reynolds, known for his left-leaning perspectives, has estimated the number of Aboriginal deaths to be around 20,000.
There can be no certainty about the Indigenous death toll. Despite this problem, which is inherent, I decided in 1981 that I should try and give some estimate. I felt it was a responsibility of an historian who had studied this subject to try and arrive at some reasonable estimate of the numbers killed. I said it was reasonable to suppose that 20,000 Aborigines had died in conflict with the settlers. It was and remains an estimate, but it was based on 10 years of research into frontier history.
Yet, even he acknowledges that this estimation is based on a mathematical formula he devised, lacking reliable historical citations. Keith Windschuttle is an esteemed Australian historian, renowned for his comprehensive series of lectures and publications on Aboriginal history, notably titled The Fabrication of Aboriginal History. Through meticulous research and analysis, Windschuttle challenges prevailing notions surrounding the concept of Aboriginal genocide, presenting evidence that disputes its veracity.
They show how deeply this version of history has now penetrated the wider culture. Our professional historians, however, are the ones responsible for this, because it's they who've created the intellectual framework for these claims and have given them an aura of academic respectability. The ultimate statement of this outlook is the newly completed National Museum in Canberra, whose architecture borrows its central theme from the Jewish Museum in Berlin, built to commemorate the Holocaust. Now, I've also used these examples because, despite the prominence and influence they had, not one of the points I've quoted from them here is true. Take the incident at Risdon Cove. There were two separate reports from the British officers there at the time. Both said a settler and his wife had been surrounded in their hut and threatened by more than 200 Aborigines. Soldiers from a nearby camp came to their rescue and shot at most 3 people. One of the reports said 3 natives were killed, the other said 2 were killed and 1 wounded. Now, these officers had no ostensible reason to lie or to downplay what happened. They were only doing their duty. However, At a government inquiry in 1830, a former convict testified that he thought, quote, 40 to 50 blacks had been killed in 1804, even though he admitted he had not been there at the time. Despite this claim being no more than a rumour 26 years after the event, it has allowed those historians who want to beat up this issue to say witnesses have claimed up to 50 Aborigines were killed. Hence, when translated into the wider culture, a defensive action with 3 adult casualties has become a massacre of 50 innocent men, women and children. And the Wall Street Journal's claim that the bodies were salted down and sent to Sydney for anthropological investigation is another rumour first made in 1830 that had no contemporary corroboration. We can be even more certain about the Bells Falls massacre of the 1820s. This is a complete fabrication. There is no contemporary evidence to support it of any kind. In fact, the first reports of this event did not appear in print until 1962, that is 120 years later, when an article in the Bathurst Times by a local amateur historian reported it as one of the oral legends of the district. Even though the story was nothing more than a folk myth, this did not stop it being taken up and reproduced in 2 1988 books, Blood on the Wattle by the journalist Bruce Elder and 6 Australian Battlefields by the noted scholar Al Grasby. In 1989, Mary Coe's book, Windradine, a Wiradjuri Koori, published by the Aboriginal Studies Press, claimed this story as part of ancient Aboriginal tradition. And the film I mentioned for school children above is from this book. The event at Forest River in 1926, described by Ben Kiernan as one of the hundreds of massacres that took place in the 20th century, has more plausibility. A Royal Commission found that 2 police, while on the hunt for an Aboriginal who had murdered a pastoralist, had themselves shot 11 natives in their custody and burnt their remains beyond recognition. Until recently, historians had no good reasons to doubt their findings. However, in 1999, the Perth journalist Rod Moran, in his book Massacre Myth, published a detailed analysis of the evidence to the Royal Commission and proved beyond reasonable doubt that no such killings ever took place. There were no eyewitnesses, no forensic evidence of human beings killed, and no ballistic evidence, no bullets. Moran produced a medical officer's analysis made at the time and largely ignored by later commentators that charred bones found at some campsites were not of human origin or were of indeterminate origin, and they were probably the remains of animals cooked over campfires. The figure of 100 dead at Forest River, cited by both Ben Kiernan and Henry Reynolds, comes from Aboriginal oral history collected in the 1970s, that is 50 years later. However, the man whose observations the West Australian Museum claims to be those of a survivor was never at Forest River in this period. Moran shows that to burn a human body beyond recognition in the open air would require an average of 2.5 tonnes of wood per person. To destroy 100 bodies, the 2 police at Forest River would have had to collect 250 tonnes of wood in country, when you look at photographs of it, is almost desert. The total number of violent deaths cited by Philip Knightley, that is between 50 and 100,000, is another case of pure invention. The only authority to suggest a total this high is the book Blood on the Wattle by Bruce Elder, a journalist whose normal specialty is rock and roll music.
His work critically examines the alleged invention and myths associated with this topic, aiming to provide a more accurate understanding of the historical events that unfolded upon the arrival of settlers in 1788. Windshuttle challenges the claim that there was a deliberate and systemic genocide of the Aboriginal population during the British colonisation of Australia. He argues while there were instances of violence and conflict, it went both ways, and it was not a coordinated effort to exterminate the Aboriginal people. An article published by The Quadrant delves into the narratives surrounding Aboriginal genocide, which have been frequently employed by Aboriginal advocates during truth-telling ceremonies and publications. The article highlights several instances where historical events have been subject to misrepresentation and mythologization. While a comprehensive review of each claim is beyond the scope of this summary, it is absolutely evident that certain purported massacres have been tracked down to fictional literature or exaggerated accounts transmitted through oral Aboriginal tradition. In this video, we delved into the complexities surrounding Australia's historical narratives, particularly those concerning alleged genocide. An earnest look into this topic reveals a deliberate endeavour to manipulate Aboriginal history, seemingly driven by political motives with intentions to discredit the nation of Australia itself. A lot of this stems back to an underlying communist agenda, which I have addressed in previous videos. A lot more could be said on this topic, which I will refer you all to the reading of Keith Windschuttle's book, The Fabrication of Aboriginal History. I suggest all of you out there give it a read. I want to thank you all for watching this video. If you liked it, be sure to share it around and check out my links in the description below. Until next time.